I want you to picture something. Picture a man who has spent 40 years learning exactly how property works. Not in theory, not from books, in practice, with his hands, with his money, with his skin in the game. A man who has bought land, hired architects, managed contractors, navigated planning permissions, arranged finance, sold completed developments, and walked away with profit. A man who has done this dozens of times across 3 Australian states. Now picture that same man standing in a lawyer's office in Phuket, Thailand, holding a document he doesn't understand, being told that the beach villa he paid £275,000 for is not worth a single pound to him, that there are 3 separate mortgages on it, that his name isn't on any of them, that the woman he spent 2 years of his life building a future with had arranged all 3 within the same 30-day window, using lenders who didn't know about each other, using a property registered in her name, using his money. That man was me. My name is Victor. I was 67 years old when I discovered what had happened. I'd like to tell you the discovery came quickly. I'd like to tell you I was sharp enough to see it coming. I wasn't. The truth is that I had convinced myself my professional experience was a shield. I believed, and I mean genuinely believed, not in a naive way but in a structured, reasoned, professional way, that my 40 years in property development made me impossible to deceive in a real estate transaction. That belief cost me everything. Let me go back to the beginning, because the beginning matters. It always matters. I grew up in Geelong, Victoria, in a house my father rented his entire life. He died in that house. Not because he chose to rent, but because he never had enough to buy. We weren't destitute, but we were close enough to poverty that I could smell it from the kitchen every morning. My mother clicked coupons. My father worked double shifts at the automotive plant. By the time I was 12, I had decided I was going to own property. Not as an investment strategy, as a survival strategy. Property meant permanence. Property meant nobody could tell you to get out. By 32, I owned my first development site. By 45, I was running a company with 11 employees, completing 3 to 5 residential developments per year across Victoria and New South Wales. I married young, divorced in my mid-40s, stayed on reasonable terms with my ex-wife, and watched my children grow up without being particularly present for any of it. That's a thing I carry. By 64, I had wound down the company, sold the final assets, and found myself with AUD 510,000 in the bank, no mortgage of my own, a modest house in Torquay, and absolutely nothing to do. Retirement, it turns out, is not restful when you've spent 4 decades in a constant state of forward motion. The first 3 months I redecorated the house. The next 3 months I went to the gym every day. By month 7 I was sitting in my garden at 2 in the afternoon on a Wednesday, feeling something I could only describe as a low-grade dread. Not depression, not boredom exactly. More like the sensation of watching a clock that has stopped and realizing you've been staring at it for hours. My mate Craig, who I'd known since our late 20s when we were both chasing permits on adjacent development sites, had retired 2 years before me. He'd done something I thought was genuinely eccentric at the time. He'd moved to Thailand, Chiang Mai specifically. He'd bought a house up in the hills, learned some basic Thai, and spent his days hiking and eating food he described in text messages with a level of enthusiasm I'd previously only heard him use when talking about zoning approvals. I flew over to see him in March 2019. I was 65. I remember stepping off the plane in Chiang Mai and feeling something shift. Not dramatically, not like a scene in a film where the music swells and the world looks different. More like a gear slipping. The warmth, the smell of night jasmine and diesel, the sound of the city at 11 at night still fully awake. It hit some part of me that had gone quiet without me noticing. I spent 10 days with Craig. We ate at street stalls and drove through mountain passes and drank cheap beer on plastic chairs. And I found myself, by day 4, not thinking about planning permissions or settlement dates or cash flow projections for the first time in decades. I felt like a man who had put down a very heavy bag and hadn't realized how heavy it was until he let go. I went home to Torquay and spent 3 weeks thinking about it. Then I booked another flight. The second trip was in September 2019. This time I went south, Phuket. I'd heard Craig's stories about it. The beaches, the expat community, the property market that was apparently booming in ways reminiscent of the Gold Coast in the 80s. I wasn't thinking about property then, not seriously. I was thinking about warmth and escape and a second act. But old habits. I walked through Bang Tao one afternoon just looking, the way I used to walk development sites before I owned them, just to get a feel for the land. And that's when I met Nong. She was working the front desk of a small real estate agency on a quiet street off the main road. I'd wandered in, partly because the air conditioning was strong and partly because there was a listing in the window for a beachside villa that caught my eye on instinct. She was 31. She had a manner that was professional without being cold, helpful without being eager. She spoke English well, clearly and precisely, with an accent that was shaped more by international business dealings than by tourist phrases. She explained the listing. She explained the Thai property market for foreign buyers, the various structures, the freehold limitations, the leasehold options, the nominee arrangements that were common in the area. She was, I noticed immediately, explaining it correctly, not simplifying for a tourist, explaining accurately, with real knowledge, the way someone explains a thing when they understand it themselves. I remember thinking, she's sharp. I found that attractive before I found anything else attractive, which should probably have told me something about where my guard would eventually drop. We had coffee that afternoon. She told me she'd been working in real estate administration for 6 years, that she handled title deed processing and mortgage applications on the agency's behalf, that she had a thorough understanding of how property changed hands in Thailand, and specifically in Phuket. She was from the island originally. Her family had been in the Bang Tao area for 2 generations. She knew every lender, every land office clerk, every lawyer who handled foreign buyer transactions within a 30-kilometer radius. I went back to Australia, and she sent me a WhatsApp message 3 days later about a property that had come on the market. It was professional. Just that. I messaged back, she messaged back. Over the following weeks it became something else, though neither of us named it quickly. By December, I had booked another trip, and the purpose of the trip was not, in any real sense, about property. I want to be careful here about how I describe what followed, because I can already hear the skepticism and I want to address it directly. I know what it looks like from the outside. 65-year-old Australian man, recently retired, no structure in his life, meets a 31-year-old Thai woman who works in real estate. I know the narrative. I'd heard it from other men. I'd read about it online. I had in fact mentioned it to Craig when I told him I was going back to Phuket, and he'd gone quiet for a moment before saying, carefully, that he hoped I was keeping my eyes open. I told him I was. I told him that of all the things I was in my life, I was not a man who got deceived in property transactions. That of all the contexts in which someone might try to take advantage of me, a real estate context was exactly the wrong one to choose. Craig didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Fair enough, mate." He would say more later. He would say a great deal more later. January 2020. I arrived back in Phuket, and Nong met me at the airport. This time there was no pretense that I was there to look at listings. We spent 2 weeks together. She showed me the island the way a local shows someone a place they love. The early morning markets before the heat. The fishing villages that tourists didn't reach. The hidden beaches on the west coast that required driving down unmarked roads and parking on grass. She cooked for me in her apartment, a small but precise kitchen where she prepared food I couldn't name, but ate with an enthusiasm that surprised me. I remember the green curry she made one evening, the smell of kaffir lime and galangal, and something that burned at the back of my throat in exactly the right way. I was wearing the lightweight gray linen shirt she'd suggested I buy at the market 2 days earlier. She'd held it up and said it suited me. I remember all of this with a clarity I can't entirely explain. By the end of those 2 weeks, I had made a decision. I told her I was going to spend more time in Thailand. She didn't react with the excitement I might have expected. She was measured, thoughtful. She said she was glad. She said she needed to understand what more time meant. That conversation, her caution about definitions, Her careful way of not assuming more than was offered made me trust her more than almost anything else in those first months. I flew home, listed my Torquay house, and arranged to rent it out. I was back in Phuket by April. We moved into a rented house together in Bang Tao in May 2020. It was a sensible arrangement, or so I told myself. A rented property, no financial commitment, a trial period of sorts. I had 40 years of experience, structuring things prudently, and this felt prudent. The house was comfortable, not luxurious. A two-bedroom property with a pool that was more decorative than functional, and a garden that grew things I couldn't identify. Nong handled the rental negotiation herself, speaking rapid Thai on the phone to the landlord's agent, then translating the key points for me. This was the first time I watched her work in Thai and thought, she knows what she's doing. I felt reassured by this. I was reassured by her competence. That's worth noting. 3 months in, she mentioned her mother. The family was from the north of the island. Her mother ran a small food stall, noodle soup, fresh every morning, sold out by 10 o'clock. Her father had died when she was 17. She had a younger brother, 24, who was working in construction, but struggling to find consistent contracts. She mentioned these things without drama. No requests attached, just context. I found myself genuinely interested in these details in a way that I hadn't expected. I'd spent 40 years talking to contractors and town planners and bank managers. I hadn't spent much time in the previous decade being interested in people. We fell into a domestic life that surprised me with how readily it came. She was precise in the mornings, up before 6, coffee made before I reached the kitchen, her day already organized before mine had started. This was not the behavior of someone coasting on novelty. I had lived alone for the better part of 15 years after my divorce, and I had grown accustomed to a kind of quiet that I'd told myself suited me. She filled the house in a way that reminded me it hadn't been quiet so much as empty. I didn't examine this too closely. Looking back, I think I was afraid that if I examined it, I might not trust it. She introduced me to her mother in June, a small woman in her 60s, deeply tanned, who ran her noodle stall in the pre-dawn dark with the efficiency of someone who had performed the same actions 10,000 times without variation. She didn't speak English. We communicated through Nong, and through the particular warmth of a woman who feeds you well and watches you eat. Her mother looked at me with something I read as cautious approval, the look of a woman who has learned to measure foreign men against a hard history of foreign men. I wanted to earn that approval. That wanting was genuine, and I am not ashamed of it. But I can see now how it was also useful to her daughter, that my desire to be accepted by the family made me generous in ways that felt like love rather than expenditure. In August 2020, her brother needed money for a work vehicle. The amount was 45,000 baht, which at the time was roughly 900 Australian dollars. She mentioned it the way you might mention a minor inconvenience. Not a request, just a fact. I offered. She resisted briefly. I insisted. She accepted. It felt good. That's the honest truth. It felt genuinely good. The way it feels when you can absorb a small cost that represents a large relief for someone else. I told myself this was generosity. I didn't ask for the money back. It never came up again. The months that followed were, and I say this knowing how it sounds, among the better months of my adult life. The structure I'd lost in retirement returned in a different form. Not projects and deadlines, but the rhythm of days that had texture. Morning markets, long drives, evenings on the terrace with food she cooked, and conversation that ranged more widely than anything I'd had in years. She was curious about my work, my projects, the mechanics of how I'd built and sold things. I was curious about hers, about how property actually worked in Thailand, the land title system, the difference between Chanote and Norsor Sam documents, the informal lending networks that operated outside the banking system. She explained all of it with the same precision she'd shown that first afternoon in the agency. I realize now that I was being educated, that the education was deliberate, that she was teaching me to trust her expertise, so that, when the time came, I would defer to it. In November 2020, she found the villa. It was in Bang Tao, close enough to the beach that on clear mornings you could hear the surf. The property sat on just under a rai of land, which is roughly 1,600 square meters. A four-bedroom house, built maybe 15 years earlier but maintained with care, white-walled and high-ceilinged, with a proper pool and a garden full of frangipani and palms. The listing price was 14 million baht. At that time, the exchange rate put that at approximately 275,000 pounds sterling, which was the currency I'd begun to think in because the Australian dollar was doing something unhelpful against the baht. The property was on a Chinook title, the highest and most secure class of land title in Thailand. She showed me the document. I looked at it the way I'd looked at title documents for 40 years. It told me what it was supposed to tell me. There was, of course, the issue of Thai law. As a foreign national, I could not own land outright. This was not new information. I'd known about this since my first visit. The common solutions were leasehold arrangements or nominee structures, registering the property in the name of a Thai national on behalf of the foreign buyer. Nong explained the options. She had done this for agency clients before, she said. She understood the mechanics completely. The simplest, cleanest arrangement for our situation was to register the property in her name. We were, she noted, a couple. This would eventually, in time, be regularized. But in terms of immediate legal structure, with a property in her name and a cohabitation agreement in place, I would be protected. She showed me examples of how other foreign buyers had structured similar arrangements. I want to be transparent about the next decision, because I was not, by any measure, ignorant of what I was doing. I had built a career on understanding the risks of legal structures. I knew that registering property in a nominee's name created exposure. I knew that without my name on a title, my position was dependent on trust rather than law. I knew all of this. And I proceeded anyway, not out of ignorance, out of what I can only describe as professional arrogance. I believed that my knowledge of the mechanics made me safer than other foreign buyers. I believed that because I understood the risk, I could manage it. I believed that Nong, who shared my understanding of property finance, was not a risk at all, but a partner. We signed the purchase agreement in January 2021. The 14 million baht came from my AUD account, converted in 2 transfers approximately 3 weeks apart to avoid single transfer reporting thresholds, a practice she suggested as routine for large transactions, which in retrospect I should have questioned harder. The property was registered in Nong's name on the 28th of January. She cried at the land office. Not dramatically, just a tear that she caught with the back of her hand. She said it was the most significant thing she had ever owned. I remember feeling proud of that. I felt like I had given her something real. What she had actually acquired, in that moment, was the legal instrument she needed. The behavioral changes were not immediate. That's what makes this particular kind of thing so effective. The gap between the trigger and the visible shift is wide enough that you don't connect them. Looking back now, I can plot it precisely. The transformation began in February 2021, exactly 1 month after the title transfer. But at the time, February of 2021 felt like February of any other month. There were small things. Her phone, which had previously sat on the table between us during meals, began to go face down. This was nothing. I noticed it and didn't think about it again. She began spending more time at her mother's, sometimes staying overnight when she said her mother was unwell. Again, nothing. She seemed tired on some evenings in a way she hadn't before, more distracted, quicker to end conversations. I assumed she was busy. The agency had picked up, she said. There were more transactions than usual as the property market came back after the COVID disruptions. In March, her cousin had a motorcycle accident. The medical costs came to 35,000 baht, around 700 pounds. She mentioned it apologetically. I wired the money. She thanked me with a warmth that seemed genuine, and I didn't think about it again for weeks. In April, her brother's construction work contract fell through. His employer, a small local firm, had gone under. He needed 80,000 baht, about 1,600 pounds, to bridge the gap and retrain. The figure was larger than the previous requests, but still, in the context of what we had, not significant. I transferred it. She transferred something to him. I didn't ask for documentation. I was sitting on the terrace one evening in May, reading something on my tablet, when I caught part of a phone call she was taking inside. She was speaking in Thai, which was normal, but I heard my name, or what I thought was my name, and then a word I'd learned, Ngern, which means money. Then she laughed. A specific laugh I hadn't heard before. Not her usual laugh. Something flatter. She came back to the terrace a few minutes later, and I asked who she'd been speaking to. She said it was her sister. She sat down and picked up her book, and I sat with an odd feeling in my chest that I couldn't explain, and chose not to examine. The first bank call came in June. I was at a cafe near the beach when my phone rang. The caller was a woman from a financial institution I'd never heard of, speaking English with a heavy accent. She asked if I was the owner of a property at an address in Bang Tao. I told her I was not the owner in the legal sense, but I was the resident. She asked if I knew Nong by her full legal name. I said yes. She thanked me and said she would call back. She hung up before I could ask anything further. I sat with that call for a long time. I ordered another coffee. I looked out at the beach. I turned the call over in my mind from different angles. The way I used to turn a plot plan over when something didn't quite resolve. There was a straightforward explanation. The agency used Nong as a contact for property-related correspondence. The call was probably administrative. A lender dealing with a client file. Nothing to do with us. I didn't tell her about the call for 3 days. When I did, I mentioned it casually, watching her. She said it was probably related to a client file she'd been managing. A buyer who had arranged finance. She'd been the contact point. She was relaxed, confident. She changed the subject smoothly and I let her. By August, a second emergency had materialized. This time it was her mother's food stall. A landlord dispute had resulted in her mother needing to relocate and fit out a new space. The cost Nong quoted was 120,000 baht, roughly 2,400 pounds. She said she could cover half from savings. She said she didn't want to ask me. Then she asked me. I transferred 60,000 baht that afternoon. I told her not to worry about the other half either. She said I was too generous. She was right, but not in the way she meant. Craig came to visit in September 2021. He'd driven down from Chiang Mai, which is a long drive, partly, I think, because he wanted to see me. We sat on the terrace of the villa with beers, and he looked at the property, and the pool, and the frangipani, and said it was beautiful. He said it slowly, the way you say a thing when you're thinking about something else. We talked for a while about nothing, and then he told me about a man he knew in Chiang Mai, British man, mid-50s, had bought a house in his Thai partner's name. The partner had taken out a loan against the property without his knowledge. The man had found out when the lender had come to collect. He was in the process of trying to sue, Craig said. But there wasn't much he could do because the property was in her name and the loan was legal. I listened. I nodded. I said that was awful. And then I said that our situation was different because Nong and I were a genuine partnership, because she was a property professional herself and understood exactly what was at stake. Because I wasn't some lonely tourist who'd been swept up by a beautiful face. I was a property developer with 40 years of experience, who had gone into this arrangement with his eyes open. Craig looked at me for a moment. He didn't argue. He said he was sure I was right. We watched the pool lights come on as the sun went down, and neither of us said anything further about it. That conversation was the loudest warning I received. I dismissed it in real time, as the concern of a friend who didn't know my situation as well as I did. September turned into October. The property market on the island was moving. Nong was busy. There were weeks where she came home late, 4 evenings out of 7, where her phone was constantly in her pocket rather than left anywhere I might accidentally see it. One evening she came home with a new phone, a significantly more expensive model than her previous one. She said the agency had upgraded all their admin staff. I didn't ask to see the receipt. I notice now, writing this down, that I keep using the phrase, I didn't ask. I didn't ask about the phone. I didn't ask about the bank call. I didn't ask for receipts from the transfers. The thing is, 40 years of property development had taught me to ask everything, to interrogate every assumption, to demand documentation for even the most routine transaction. I did not apply any of that to my personal life. Not because I was ignorant of the principle, but because applying it would have required me to treat our relationship as a transaction, and I had decided it wasn't one. That decision, the decision not to be the kind of man who applies business logic to love, was the single most expensive decision of my life. An expat I knew casually, a retired British engineer named Ian, who I sometimes encountered at a cafe near the main road, mentioned one afternoon that he'd heard of a case. He was careful to frame it as something he'd heard, not something he knew personally, where a foreign buyer had discovered mortgages registered against a property he'd funded. I was standing waiting for my takeaway coffee. I said it sounded like a complicated situation. He said it was more common than people thought. I said I could imagine. My coffee arrived. I said goodbye to Ian and walked back to the villa and thought, briefly, about what he'd said, and then thought about what we were having for dinner, and the thought about Ian was gone before I reached the gate. In October, a third financial request arrived, this one framed as an opportunity rather than an emergency. A parcel of land nearby, she said, was being sold by an elderly owner who needed to settle quickly. 2 Rai, excellent position, a price that was below market because of the speed required. If we could move 60 days later, we could sell at a 25% profit minimum. She had a buyer already, informally. The cost was 800,000 baht, around 16,000 pounds. This was genuinely in the territory of my professional experience. I looked at the land. I asked the right questions. She had answers to all of them, detailed and correct. I wired the 800,000 baht. Over the following months, I would ask periodically about the land deal. She would say it was progressing, that there had been complications with the buyer's financing, that these things took time. They took time until I stopped asking, which was when I understood, far too late, that the deal had never existed. The lawyer's letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in December 2021. It was delivered to the villa. The envelope was addressed to Nong by her full legal name and marked with the name of a law firm in Phuket town. She wasn't home. She was at the agency. The letter was sitting on the mat when I came back from my morning walk. I almost didn't open it. It wasn't addressed to me. But there's a thing that happens when you've been in business for 40 years. A specific kind of instinct that kicks in when something is wrong in a property context. A pattern recognition that doesn't require conscious thought. I stood in the hallway for what felt like a long time. I was wearing my walking shoes, still damp from the dew on the grass. I could hear the ceiling fan in the living room, the one that had been making a slight clicking sound for weeks, that I kept meaning to report to the maintenance company. I opened the letter. It was in Thai, but there was an English summary attached, as apparently required by the lender's international correspondence protocols. It was from a company that described itself as a specialist property lending institution. It referenced a property by address, our villa. It referenced a loan of 3.2 million baht, secured against that property. It stated that 3 payments had been missed, and that legal proceedings to recover the debt were being initiated. I sat down on the hallway floor. Not on a chair, on the floor. I don't know why. My legs simply took me down. I read the letter again. I read the English summary 4 times. I looked at the figures. 3.2 million baht. At current rates, approximately 64,000 pounds. Secured against a property I had paid 275,000 pounds for. I sat there on the tiles until the feeling in my hands came back, and then I took photographs of every page of the document. I called a lawyer I'd been given a contact for by a British expat I knew slightly from the area, a man named Ian who had worked in property law in Thailand for a decade. He answered on the 3rd ring. I explained, slowly, what the letter said. He asked several questions. He then said something that took approximately 10 minutes to fully enter my comprehension. He said, "Let's start by pulling the title history." The title history took 48 hours to obtain through the Phuket Land Office. I did not speak to Nong about the letter for those 48 hours. I told her it had been something administrative for the agency and I'd put it aside for her. She accepted this without curiosity, which was, I understand now, because she already knew what it contained. The title history showed 3 registered encumbrances on the property, 3 separate mortgages. The first, with the institution from the letter, was for 3.2 million baht. The second was with an informal lending entity, what is known locally as a loan shark, operating through a quasi-formal structure, for 2.8 million baht. The third was with another private lender, a different entity again, for 2.5 million baht. All 3 mortgages had been registered within a 30-day window in February 2021. The same month the title had transferred into her name. The same month I had been congratulating myself on completing the purchase cleanly. The total encumbrance against the property was 8.5 million baht, against a property I had paid 14 million baht for, and none of the mortgage proceeds had been used to service any debt related to me. She had received 8.5 million baht, approximately 170,000 pounds, distributed across 3 separate lenders who didn't know about each other, arranged through her professional connections at the agency, using her intimate knowledge of how to keep applications separated across different parts of the lending network. She had processed title deeds and mortgage applications every working day for 6 years. She knew exactly how to do this and exactly how not to get caught. I called Ian from the car park of a 7-Eleven in Bang Tao because I needed to be somewhere that wasn't the villa. He confirmed what I suspected. All 3 mortgages were legally registered. The property was in her name. She was the legal owner. The mortgages were hers to take. Nothing she had done was illegal under Thai law. The only potential avenue was a civil fraud claim based on the informal agreement between us, the understanding that I had funded the purchase and that the property was being held in her name on my behalf. But that understanding was not documented. There was no contract. There was no nominee agreement formalized in Thai. There was nothing except the transfers from my account, which proved I had sent money, but did not prove the purpose for which it was sent. Ian said these words slowly, because he had clearly said them before and understood they needed to land properly. The property is in her name. The mortgages are in her name. You have no registered interest in the property. You are, legally, a tenant. I told Nong that evening. I came back to the villa, and I put the title history printouts on the kitchen table, and I told her I knew. I'd been in confrontational conversations before, with contractors, with council planners, with business partners whose interests had diverged from mine. I knew what professional deception looked like when it was caught. I knew the faces it made. She made a face I hadn't seen before. Not guilt, not panic, a kind of stillness, as if she were waiting to see which approach would be most effective. She said I didn't understand how difficult things had been for her family. She said the money from the mortgages had gone to clear debts her family had been carrying for years. Debts that I wouldn't understand because I'd never had to borrow from informal lenders at rates that compounded weekly. She said she had always planned to repay the mortgages once the property increased in value. She said she had done it for us, for our future, so that her family could be free of the burden that had sat on them her entire life. She said I was behaving like every other Farang who thought he could buy his way into Thailand and own things that didn't belong to him. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I am not explaining this as a point of pride. I think at that moment I was simply beyond the kind of emotion that requires expression. I asked her one question. I asked whether the money for her cousin's accident, her brother's vehicle, her brother's retraining, her mother's stall relocation, and the land deal that never happened, whether any of that had actually gone to those purposes. She didn't answer. She picked up her phone and walked out to the garden and made a call in Thai. I calculated the total the following morning with a spreadsheet, the way I'd calculated project costs for 40 years. The villa, 275,000 pounds. The 45,000 baht for the brother's vehicle, roughly 900 pounds. The 80,000 baht for the brother's retraining, 1,600 pounds. The 35,000 baht for the cousin's accident, 700 pounds. The 120,000 baht for the mother's stall, 2,400 pounds. The 800,000 baht for the land that didn't exist, 16,000 pounds. Add the mortgage proceeds she had drawn against the property, 8.5 million baht, approximately 170,000 pounds. proceeds which came from lenders who would now be pursuing the property for repayment, further eroding whatever theoretical value I might otherwise have tried to argue I held. Total loss, somewhere in the vicinity of £466,000, though the indirect costs, legal fees, living expenses during the period, the cost of relocating, pushed the real figure higher. I sat with that spreadsheet and a glass of water, and looked at the numbers the way I'd looked at development budgets for 4 decades. They told a clean, clear story. The numbers always do. Ian was direct about my options. A civil case was possible but expensive, likely to take years, and uncertain in its outcome given the absence of a written nominee agreement. The mortgagee lenders would be pursuing the property through their own legal channels. If all three moved to enforce simultaneously, and there was reason to think they might, given that the payments had been defaulted, the property could be sold at auction to settle the debts. If the auction price covered all 3 mortgages, there would potentially be a residual. Given that the total mortgage value was 8.5 million baht against a 14 million baht property, a residual was theoretically possible, but only theoretically. Auction prices in distressed circumstances, Ian noted, rarely reflected market values. I flew to Chiang Mai to see Craig. I needed to tell someone in person. He met me at a restaurant near the night bazaar. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, which is something I've always respected about him. When I finished, he was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I should have said more when I visited." I told him it wouldn't have made a difference. That was the truth, and we both knew it. He told me about 4 other men he knew personally. Not through rumor, not through expat forum gossip, but personally knew, who had experienced variations of the same situation. Different women, different structures, different amounts, same fundamental mechanism. Property in a name that wasn't theirs. Mortgages they didn't know about. Money gone. He said the property developer point, the professional experience angle, was the most dangerous version of the trap because it gave men the precise kind of confidence they needed to lower the guard they should have raised. I stayed 3 days in Chiang Mai. My daughter called while I was there. She lives in Melbourne. She's a solicitor, which meant the conversation had a particular quality of professional precision layered over genuine distress. She asked very carefully worded questions. I answered honestly. She said she was booking flights. I told her not to. She said she was doing it anyway. She arrived 2 days after I returned to Phuket, and it was her presence, her efficient, clear-eyed, non-judgmental presence, that allowed me to do the practical things. The police report, which Ian advised filing even though it was unlikely to result in prosecution, given the complexity of the legal questions. The formal notification to the 3 mortgage lenders. The cessation of any further payments to Nong or her family. The packing. I did not see Nong again after the evening she walked into the garden. She was at her mother's, I was told by text. She asked for certain personal items to be left outside the villa. My daughter packed her things while I was out. I did not leave a note. The last morning in the villa, I walked the garden once. The frangipani were flowering. White flowers with yellow centers, against the blue sky that Phuket does better than almost anywhere I've been. The pool was clean, the house was clean, the ceiling fan in the living room was clicking. I had never arranged the repair. I left Thailand in February 2022. I'm back in Australia now, in a small flat in Geelong, the same city I grew up in, which has a symmetry I am not sure how to feel about. My retirement funds are largely gone. I'm not destitute. I have the house in Torquay, which I've now sold to give myself some liquidity. But the capital I spent 40 years building, the money I'd planned to live on for the rest of my life, is substantially depleted. I'm 67 years old, and my financial position is what it was when I was in my late 30s, before the good years. I've thought a lot about what happened. Not in the way you obsess over something, going over it looking for the decision that could have been different. More in the professional way, the post-project debrief, the assessment of what went wrong and why. And what I keep coming back to is this. The professional experience wasn't irrelevant. It wasn't that I was foolish in the ways that property novices are foolish. I wasn't ignorant of the risks of nominee structures. I wasn't unaware of the legal exposure. I understood all of it. The mistake was precisely that understanding. Because I understood the risks, I believed I could see them clearly enough to manage them. Because I could identify the mechanism of deception, I believed I was too smart to be deceived by it. What I didn't understand, what I genuinely failed to account for, was that Nong understood all of the same things I understood, and had spent 6 years learning the specific ways that professional knowledge could be used against someone who had it. She didn't deceive me by hiding what I didn't know. She deceived me by using what I did know as a blindfold. The rule I thought protected me, that my experience made me impossible to deceive in a real estate transaction anywhere in the world, was the rule that made me possible to deceive. Because the only thing that was actually the same between property development in Australia and property ownership in Thailand was my willingness to trust the paperwork when someone I trusted had prepared it. There is one thing I want to say directly to anyone who is reading this in the position I was in before I got on that plane. Not the person who is already home with their losses tallied and their lawyer's bills paid. The person who is somewhere between the first trip and the villa purchase. The person who has met someone sharp and warm and professional, who happens to work in Thai real estate, and happens to understand property law, and happens to be 31 years old. The person who has already, when a friend expressed gentle concern, explained at length why his situation is different. Nothing I say will change your mind if you're committed to the belief that your situation is different. I know that because nothing changed mine. But I'll say it anyway. The property laws are different. The title system is different. The legal recourse available to a foreign buyer is different. The lending networks are different. But the human willingness to trust someone who makes you feel valued and understood and capable, that is not different at all. That is exactly the same everywhere in the world. And if you are a man who has spent 40 years being good at something, and that competence has made you feel safe, and a person you love has made you feel safer still, then you are not more protected than other men. You are more exposed than most. I'm going to be fine. I tell myself that and I believe it most days. Geelong is smaller than I remember and larger than I need. The morning light here is different from Phuket. Harder, cleaner, less forgiving. I've started walking in the mornings again along the waterfront. I pass the old streets I knew at 12 years old, when my father worked double shifts and my mother clipped coupons, and I told myself that property meant permanence. I'm 67. I'm starting again. The ceiling fan in the Phuket villa is still clicking, I imagine. Nobody ever fixed it.